André Citroën, a man, a visionary, a captain of industry, and more than just a name, a symbol of French audacity and progress. Citroën's first trade was making gears. During his second year at university, he was on holiday at his sister's in Poland and discovered a gear-making machine in a little workshop. He borrowed the money he needed, which wasn't much, from his brother-in-law to buy the license to make gears with this machine. Back in France, with his studies over and his military service completed, he opened a small workshop. He started off with 3 craftsmen, but gradually it eventually became a great success, and he started to expand his workforce. He became known to the car manufacturers of the day, and in particular the Morse brothers. Their car factory, which had seen its glory days in the early part of the century, was in difficulties, and they were thinking of selling their business. Citroën was offered the job of managing director at the Morse factory, which he accepted. He reorganized the company, making numerous system changes. He remotivated the workforce, and in just a few years he had increased Morse car production by 1,000%. In 1914, the increasingly successful Citroën was requisitioned for the war effort. The government asked him to organise the production of shells. In the factories he built on the Quai de Javel, he built 10,000, then 20,000, then 55,000 shells per day. In 4 years, Citroën produced 25% of French shells, over 25 million. The war over, Citroën needed a new direction. Encouraged by his experience with Morse and his own extraordinary intuition, he decided to build cars. And he did nothing by half. He got rid of his old equipment, pulled down and rebuilt his factory, and bought hundreds of new machines from the Americans. The Quai de Javel factories would build cars like he built shells on the assembly line. The emblem of the company would be a double chevron, a reminder of the gears he started off his career with. The United States was El Dorado for André Citroën. He made countless round trips with his family, studying the production methods of the Detroit giants. His son Maxime remembers. His hero was Henry Ford, and nothing pleased him more to be called the French Ford in the United States. Through his meetings with Henry Ford, Citroën learnt automobile mass production techniques, and the Frenchie had a plan. He wanted to democratize the car to create demand, and he understood that he had to produce a cheap car in great quantities. In 1919, he was turning out 30 Type A's every day. It was followed in 1921 by the B2, but it was the 1922 Type C, known as the 5CV, that was the first step towards a truly popular car. The 5CV, or more correctly the 5HP, was built as a tourer, a 2-seater, and a 3-seater cabriolet, which was nicknamed the Clover. The ever-increasing production needed a similar increase in staff, and as he had done before, Citroën looked after his workforce. During the war, since all the men were at the front, his workforce became largely feminine. And because Citroën wanted his women workers to be happy at their work, he introduced several new measures, particularly concerning childcare and health. He opened day nurseries and provided rooms where women could breastfeed their babies. He created a clinic within his factory with 7 full-time doctors. He provided dentists, and there was a factory canteen. We take all these things for granted nowadays, but at the time no factories, or very, very few, had such facilities. Citroën was a pioneer in providing for the social needs of his workforce. Although his staff were no longer exclusively feminine, Citroën continued to provide facilities for his car workers. Citroën revolutionized the industry, reinventing the idea of social responsibility in work. Canteens with background music, nurseries and even a clinic. He was a pioneer in this respect, and everyone praised him, including the industry minister. We are very proud that there are more and more bosses who don't think that their responsibilities end with just paying a wage to their employees. Citroën was somewhat more pragmatic. We are continually striving to improve your working conditions at the factory. I am pleased to take this opportunity to announce that this year's Christmas party, where we can all get together and is great fun for your children, will be on the 25th of December at the Sports Centre. As every year, there will be entertainment, distribution of toys, refreshments and raffle. Over 17,000 staff and their children will be able to get together. I hope you have a good meal, my dear friends, and may French good humour prevail. In America, the old steel bodywork was replacing the traditional wooden steel design, and Citroën was not far behind. His company produced the first ever European all-steel model, the B10. In 1925, the B10 became the B12 and introduced integral braking on all four wheels. Citroën wasn't really a classic car engineer. He didn't invent any particular part or process, but he reinvented the motor car. He was the first to realize that a car was not just an object that was sold to the public, and once sold was then forgotten about. He had understood that a car was a service that your clients demanded. Citroën had very early on realized that a car must be cheap to make, buy and run. The driver had to be able to take to the wheel without any worries about his car or its maintenance. His dealers had to provide cover throughout all French territory and offer a quality service at fixed prices. He introduced return and exchange, spare parts catalogues, a one-year guarantee on all his cars, and even car finance packages. And it wasn't just the clients who benefited. Every year, every dealer received full details of every new Citroën car, accompanied by advice on sales techniques. To let the world know what he was doing, and to get support for his numerous projects, Citroën practically invented the art of modern automobile advertising. And not just advertising. He was a master of what today we would call communication. The car manufacturer didn't stop at real cars. Citroën was the first company to build toys of its models. Now, Junior could have the same car as his dad. It was obviously an excellent way to introduce the Chevron into the family home, and the Citroenettes were sought after by a whole new generation of boys. In 1923, another ingenious idea. 150,000 road signs carrying the twin chevrons were put up all over France to guide the increasing traffic. Following the example of the Michelin Guide, Citroën was helping motorists, but getting his name known at the same time. Modern car publicity started here, and its originator had other tricks up his sleeve. His daughter Jacqueline remembers.
For the 1925 arts exhibition, my father prepared a great surprise for friends and family. He hired one of the Paris riverboats, and at 10 o'clock that night we were cruising down the river. No one knew what was going to happen, when suddenly the Eiffel Tower started to light up. Then one after the other the letters of my father's name appeared on the tower.
What a formidable publicity scoop, and what resources, over 200,000 bulbs, over 1 million watts, and letters over 30 metres high. The spectacle lit up the Parisian sky for over 3 years. The 21st of May 1927, Charles Lindbergh landed his Spirit of St. Louis at Le Bourget after a 6,000-kilometre slog over the Atlantic. He claimed that the 300-metre-high lighthouse had helped him to find his way into Paris. André Citroën invited Lindbergh to the Javel factories. The boss asked all his employees to come and cheer the handsome American. His courage and endurance were two qualities the Frenchman wanted to associate with his cars. And now all of France, Europe and the world over knew about Citroën. Even Josephine Baker sang her praises.
Et longtemps c'est ma vie, avec toujours mon âme est ravie. À l'amour je jurerai, oui je préfère encore la belle voiture Citroën avec son confort. Plaisir d'amour, tu appelles on oublie la Citroën dure toute la vie.
The company stopped at nothing to get itself known, and its publicity was as spectacular as it was informative. In 1932, newsreels showed the tests of the new monocoque bodywork. The graceful manoeuvres of the Rosalie allowed prospective customers to catch sight of the advantages of this production method. The one-piece body shell was much more robust than the old steel model. André Citroën adored show business. This love probably came from his brother Bernard, who ran a cabaret before the war, a war from which he didn't come back. In publicity terms, Citroën had hit hard with Limburg, high with the Eiffel Tower, and now he wanted to go further. Much further. Another first-class example of publicity were the great transcontinental expeditions, organised by Citroën using Autoschnee track cars. But again, you must understand that these were not just publicity stunts. They illustrated what Citroën thought the automobile was capable of. It was a marvellous instrument of freedom and discovery. Citroën had already shown his mettle in 1922, when 5-tracked converted B2s crossed the Sahara from Algiers to Timbuktu. Flushed from this success, the African expedition crossed the dark continent from Algeria to Tanarive, the capital of Madagascar. The journey of 28,000 kilometres ran from the 28th of October 1924 to the 28th of June 1925. Soon afterwards, Citroën created Citracit, the Citroën Trans-Sahara Company, whose aim was to offer safaris across Africa in tracked vehicles to rich tourists. Political intrigue and bad luck put an end to the project. The first great expedition was the first crossing of the Sahara Desert, then the African expedition. These were followed by the Far East expedition, whose success tended to overshadow the first two journeys, which were much less well known. But the first two were quite splendid, especially the first crossing of the Sahara. Several attempts had already been made, mostly by the army, to cross the desert in motorized vehicles. And to date, every attempt had ended in disaster. When Citroën met Kegres, the inventor of the Autoschnee, he was convinced that what had been invented to enable the Russian royal family to be able to drive in winter on ice and snow could be adapted to allow travel over sand. Thus he organised the very first successful automobile crossing of the Sahara from Algeria to Timbuktu. In charge of the expedition was Georges-Marie Hart, a long-time friend and collaborator, helped by Louis Audouin de Breuil, a former navigator who had become a Sahara automobile expert. In early 1931, Citroën looked east, and the Yellow Expedition was born. Two groups of track C6s and C4Fs left respectively from Beirut and Peking, met halfway, and then all set off back to Peking. They set off on the 4th of April, and the men who had led the African expedition, Hart and Dubreuil, were again in control. After a trouble-free crossing of India, a slightly more daunting obstacle faced the Pamir group led by Hart. The Himalayas, the roof of the world, and there was no other way. If there was no way through, rocks were dynamited. If bends were too light, the cars were jacked round corners. And if the path was too small, a new one was cut through the rock. Climbing and more climbing. It was a race against the clock. They had to get through before winter hit these high plains. But it was a long way from the rudimentary African expedition. Over 30 men and their mules followed the track cars. Cars which were powered by the formidable new 6-cylinder Citroën engines, which could take 2 tons of metal up the steepest slopes. Cécillon was at the wheel when suddenly he felt the ground move beneath him. "What am I sitting on?" he asked. "Nothing," replied Art. He stayed 5 hours in the car without moving over a 200-metre sheer drop. It took 5 hours for the hoisting gear and winches to secure the car and rebuild the route under the tracks. 5 hours of torture for poor Cécillon. And when the route was too narrow, the cars were taken to pieces. Local porters were hired to carry the entrails of these steel monsters. Like phantoms, they tracked over narrow ledges with hundreds of kilograms on their frail shoulders. On the other side, mechanics put the cars back together again, but precious time was lost. Meanwhile, the China group, led by Victor Point and Pavlovsky, progressed fairly easily. After the dusty paths and the searing heat of the valleys, the passes welcomed our heroes with 6 meters of snow, permanent snow, which tested the yellow Citroëns and Kegues's astonishing track invention to the full. On some 45-degree slopes, it took 10 hours to advance just 6 kilometers, and it was very, very cold. And what goes up must come down, dangerous descents with no grip. At the valley bottoms, swollen rivers had to be forded, some with many subsidiaries that had to be crossed and recrossed, and then up the snowy slopes again. And the cold was worse than ever, and the men couldn't warm up in the open-top track cars, which in any case were loaded with supplies and equipment. 8,000 kilometers from there, Point and Pavlovsky entered Sinkayan, en route for the capital, Urumqi. Arriving at Gilgit on the Pakistani high plains, Art got the bad news that Marshal King, the governor of Sinkayan, was holding the China group to ransom. Art decided to go and rescue him. He left the track cars and set off with a caravan of horses and mules. The quickly moving caravan arrived in Turkestan on the high Central Asian plains, the kingdom of the Kyrgyz nomads. They were in a hurry. Camels replaced the horses. Back in Paris, André Citroën was putting together the ransom demanded by the pirate governor. More track vehicles were hurriedly prepared and sent out in boxes on the Trans-Siberian Railway. The ransom arrived just in time to free Point and Art, who had in turn been captured. Free, the 2 men set off to meet up with the Pamir group, who had been slowly working eastwards. The 8th of October, the 2 groups finally met up at Assy. They knew the worst was over and took a short photo shoot before setting off for China. And they were all there, Victor Point and Georges-Marie Art, Adouin de Breuil and Petro Pavlovsky, Racan et Lefebvre, Dr. Deleste and the mechanic Ballaudet, the geographer Williams, the painter Yakolev and the father Tailleur de Chardin. The expedition now crossed Mongolia, but the hostage incident had delayed them. A new obstacle was now before them. The terrible winter of Central Asia, which they had hoped to avoid, and the Yellow River was frozen. Crossing its thousands of tributaries and streams took an enormous effort. At last they reached Imperial China, but China was at war. Everywhere were ruined cities, the Great Wall in pieces, misery and sickness. After a journey of 12,000 kilometers, the expedition finally entered the west gate of Peking on the 12th February 1932 to a hero's welcome. Georges-Marie Art received the tie of the Légion d'honneur from local French authorities. He was at the height of his fame. But the 18th of March, in Hong Kong, Art died from pneumonia contracted during his epic voyage. He would be remembered as the captain and spiritual guide of this little band of adventurers, fired with the desire to beat the elements and skeptics alike. Citroën was devastated by the news. But in 1933, a revolution was being prepared at the Javel factory. The men behind the new car were the young engineer André Lefebvre and the not much older Italian stylist Flaminio Bertoni. But the Type 7, or the Traction, had a hard task to conquer. Citroën had come back jealous from a visit to Renault's plant on the Alsaillon and had completely rebuilt his factories from scratch in less than 5 months. But the cost of this, plus the enormous cost of the China expedition and the huge debts of his company, meant that Citroën was in deep financial trouble. The traction was a make or break car. To conceive and build a car as revolutionary as the traction in just a year is practically impossible. And to make it worse, Citroën had been betrayed, although perhaps the word is a bit strong, by two engineers. One was Sanson de Lavaux, who had promised Citroën an automatic gearbox. Citroën wanted his new car to be fitted with an automatic gearbox, not a manual version. And don't forget, this was only in 1934. But the gearbox had never worked, and nobody had ever dared tell Citroën. The other engineer who let him down was Grégoire, who was supposed to provide the universal joints needed for the traction avant. In order to capture the full power of the engine, the front wheels, which were also directional, needed special joints known as homocynetic. The joints that Grégoire offered seemed suitable for the job, but he continued to try to perfect them, and by the time they were delivered to the car builder, they didn't work. Citroën was forced to turn to the Americans Glenzer and Spicer, and this was another reason for the delay in producing the car. And Citroën could not afford any more delay. He had said to one of his colleagues, "It's not a question of days now, it's a question of hours." Citroën had his back against the wall. He had to get this car out, but it was impossible. The unthinkable happened. A small creditor caused the giant Citroën company to go bust, the 21st of December 1934. 143 Quai de Javel passed into the hands of its principal shareholder Michelin, and the banks insisted that André Citroën was shown the door. Pierre Boudin Michelin, son of Edouard, and Pierre Boulanger were put in charge and given the task of reducing company costs, and not least improve the company's car, particularly the traction. I started my career with Citroën by entering the Citroën training school in 1930. In my second year, I had the chance to join the prototype team at the circuit at Montlhéry, where Citroën had a laboratory. The first car I got my hands on was a Rosalie. The rocker arm engine, which powered the traction, had been previously tried on the Rosalie in a standard lateral position. And I was astonished to learn from the newspapers and the radio that the traction avant was ready. We'd never seen it. It was presented as the very last chance for the factory. Citroën wanted it to be on the road, and it was produced without hardly any testing, which is why so many modifications had to be made afterwards. It got better, but it took quite some time. Although it was André Citroën who was behind all the improvements of the traction, particularly the mechanical parts, it was Michelin who took the credit. From the 7C to the lightweight 11 and the powerful 6-cylinder 15, the traction was a great success. Its frameless body shell, independent wheels, streamlined bodywork, and its famous, yet initially criticised front-wheel drive were the keys to its success, and for 20 years it was Citroën's flagship. A queen of the road who had a mysterious secret. Some say that the 22 never really existed. I know that one model was built with a Chevrolet engine under the bonnet, and one had no engine at all. I took part in the engine test for the 22 with the engineer de Montcalm at the engine testing laboratory, and the engine was just not ready. In 1938, I saw an open-top 22, which the engineers presented to us at Montlhéry. They wanted us to give them our advice after a quick trip around the circuit. It's the only model I've ever seen, and we weren't allowed to keep it for testing. And I have no idea what engine was in it. I don't think it was a Citroën engine. that just wasn't
À
ready.
mon avis, c'était pas un moteur Citroën parce qu'il était pas terminé.
André Citroën would never know that he'd been right about the traction. He died of cancer the 3rd of July 1935. Audacity engineers had lost one of theirs. Their reign saw the introduction of the very small car, in French the TPV, a brilliant revolutionary car that André Citroën himself would have been proud of, but war beckoned.
En 38-39.
In 1938-39, I was at La Ferté-Vidame for the first tests of the TPV prototype. The testing centre at La Ferté was really top secret, because at the time, the economic battle between France and Germany to mass-produce the first popular small car was at its height. This was an extraordinary car, built in such a way and with such amazing innovations that no other car manufacturer had even thought of introducing. And the car just stuck to the road. And despite its simplicity, it was very comfortable. And once the war was over, I immediately bought one of the very first 2CVs with a 375cc engine. 1948, and the 25th Paris Car Show was opened by Vincent Auriol. France was rebuilding, but most of the cars on show were beyond the means of the average French driver. Since 1936, Pierre Boulanger had echoed André Citroën's view that the traction was too expensive. This idea was the argument behind the TPV. The hour had come to present the end result of the concept that the World War had delayed. With a dramatic gesture, Boulanger uncovered the 2CV. The reaction varied from stupefaction to mockery. The public had forgotten about the 250 Type A 2CV which had been produced in August 1939, and the TPV prototypes had simply disappeared.
J'ai découvert les trois prototypes
I came across the 3 2CV prototypes from the 1930s TPV program at La Ferté-Vidame in the mid-1990s. The maintenance manager at La Ferté-Vidame took us to one side and said that there were some TPV parts that might interest us up in a loft. So we followed this person. We climbed up a small wooden staircase which led up to the attic. And when we got to the top, we just stopped, open-mouthed. At the end of the loft, we saw the 3 prototypes under dusty covers. The first thing we thought was, how did they manage to get the 3 prototypes up here in this loft? And the second thought was, how are we going to get them down so that we can show them to the outside world? Finally, we removed part of the roof, and we hired a crane to get them down one by one onto the ground. There was no problem, and as you can see, they are in perfect condition. These 3 prototypes were not the first to be found. Monsieur Volgensanger, when he was Citroën's Director of Communication, had found the TPV either here at La Ferté-Vidame or perhaps somewhere else. But he had it restored and it's still running today. And there's another TPV prototype which was found at Michelin. When the 2CV was launched in 1948, newsreels declared, "This is a revolution in the economy car market. Citroën have presented a concept which, the least that can be said, is original. Who knows, maybe this kind of day will one day be on our roads." Who said that journalists weren't far-seeing? The 2CV ran on all roads all over the world for the next 40 years, loved by generations of hard-up youngsters, urban trendies, hippies, and other similar freedom lovers alike. And in 1973, Jacques Volgensinger was the man behind the African Challenge. This 8,000-kilometre journey allowed 100 young French drivers to experience the African adventure at the wheel of a 2CV. Sponsored by Citroën, Total and RTL, it was an up-to-date version of the great expeditions of the 20s and 30s. Still in 1973, the 2CV attracted a new young audience with the 2CV cross races.